I don't go a day in therapy without talking about boundaries. So I thought that this would be a good topic to have on this channel. So setting, upholding, managing boundaries, and in particular not feeling guilty about having boundaries is something that is really, really hard for people. So I thought that maybe having a discussion about it could be really helpful for people. So one of the hard parts about boundaries is that it's not a clear-cut science, right? So I can't sit down with 5 different people and explain boundaries in the exact same way because it's going to look different for every single person. And I think that that's why it can get a little bit confusing for people because it's not a clear-cut science, right? So boundaries for me is going to look different for you, and boundaries for someone else is going to look different for them. And so I think that that's why people get a little bit befuddled by them and maybe even shy away from them or even avoid them altogether. And so another reason I think people avoid boundaries is because they aren't always well received by other people. And so when there's any kind of pushback against them at upholding boundaries, then they just don't want to do it at all, right? Conflict is easy to avoid because it's uncomfortable. And so any kind of, well, I really don't want to do that. If that's your boundary, then I'll just not have a boundary at all. So people will shy away from that. Well, what are they, like in general, right? And of course, again, like I talked about, these are going to be super personalized to every individual, but if we can talk in general, it might help to kind of clarify them a little bit. So what are they? What are boundaries, right? So boundaries are personal space, right? My personal bubble about what I'm comfortable with about people being near me. That's a boundary, right? Personal space is one of them. What your boundary with possessions are. Whether you like people to be in your things, that sounds really odd, but you know, some people have no personal boundary space. So like going through your closet's not an issue for them. That would be an issue for me. I don't know how you feel about that, right? Or looking through your cupboards would not be an issue for some people. That would be an issue for me. I don't know how you would feel about that, right? So your own items, like in your home or in your, if you carry a bag with you or a backpack or a briefcase or whatever, like those are your personal possessions. So like think of those types of things. What would be your boundaries in that regard? So also think about your boundaries in regards to maybe your values, if you have religion in your life, what are your moral boundaries, right? These are all things that help you to contextualize what boundaries look like in your life. We'll have boundaries when it comes to the way that we communicate with one another. Some people think that boundaries in regards to relationships, right? Whether it's a colleague at work, a friendship, a romantic relationship, or a familial relationship, they think that boundaries can be troublesome within that relationship because it could cause problems, conflict, whatever. So not having boundaries is going to lead to no safety, which could also potentially lead to having conflict within the relationship, right? So it is counterintuitive to what you think when I don't want to have boundaries because it's going to cause conflict, which actually it's the opposite, it's true. So another thing that is really interesting with boundaries is that we don't think about boundaries increasing our self-esteem. So let me talk about why this is the case. So when you create a boundary, doesn't matter what kind of boundary that you create, right? Personal space, your own items, a sexual boundary, your time, it doesn't matter what kind of boundary that you create, you're increasing your self-esteem because you're saying I'm a priority. And a lot of people don't think about that, right? I'm saying this is my boundary for whatever it might be, right? And I'm saying I'm a priority. And that actually gives you more value to yourself and can increase your self-esteem because you're putting yourself first. So that's an interesting way to view it. Not having boundaries really says you're not important, which you are. So keep that in mind when you're setting boundaries. Another way that boundaries can impact our self-esteem is if you're not conserving your energy the way that you need to, it can impact us. So let me give you an example. If you've had a really rough day at work and someone in your life is really maybe we lightheartedly call them energy vampires, right? And so maybe that individual needs to suck a little bit of your energy that day, and you really have had a rough day and you have none to give. And so you really need to set a boundary to just say, I can't today. It's been a really rough day. I don't have anything left to give to anyone else. And so you need to set a boundary to just say, I can't today. We're gonna have to do this another day. Your ability to do that is actually, again, it's putting you first. If you don't put yourself first, you're dropping your energy level down again and again and again. It just depletes yourself. We've talked about self-care on videos before. If you're not taking care of yourself, you can't give to anybody else. So really conserving your energy is also a way that you can give to yourself, and boundaries is a way that you can do that. When you need to say no to a situation or to a person, and you actually say yes, resentment can build, right? So if you've got an event or a situation that you need to or have been offered to attend, but you really need to say no to. You've got 100 things on your plate and you can't add one more, but you do it anyway because you don't have good boundaries. And so then you go to the event, and the entire time that you're there, you're going to be resentful, either of the individual who invited you or of the event itself. And that actually causes a problem within the relationship, because now you're resentful of the person, because what you really needed to do is say no, but instead you said yes. So that can actually cause a problem within the relationships, but that's a lack of boundary that you have for self. So instead of, again, going back to your fear of not setting up boundaries for how that could impact the relationship, you're already impacting the relationship because you said yes when you needed to say no. So the things that boundaries are shaped by, they're shaped by culture. They're shaped by our values. They're shaped by our needs and our wants. They're shaped by our personality types, right? If you're an introvert versus an extrovert, or if you fall someplace in between. They're shaped by our life experiences, the things that we've gone through. They're also shaped by family dynamics, right? The social norms that we have within our own family of origin or our own little family that we have created, that is where boundaries can be shaped. So when you become an adult and need to then create your own boundaries, it can be tricky, because you might have the boundaries that worked for your family of origin, or sometimes none at all, because some people don't know how to do boundaries at all. And so now you go into adulthood with either no boundaries or the boundaries that worked when you were in your family of origin. And now you got to figure out, okay, well, those worked when I was younger, but they don't necessarily work now. And as you grow into your own as an adult, those boundaries need to adjust and change and shift. So one thing I do tell people is they are working on boundaries. The hardest boundaries to set, reinforce, are with family. And the reason for that is part of what I just said. You didn't have these boundaries necessarily with your family of origin. And so they're now questioning, well, wait a minute, this isn't how it's always been. Why are you changing things now? Why do you have these new rules or guidelines or what have you that you've never had before? Why are things different? And so you will have to reinforce these new guidelines or these new boundaries often, because family, well, they know us. They know how to get around they know how to push our buttons, let's say, right? That's probably the best way to describe it. So that doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. That just means it's normal. So I'd like to talk about boundaries as being rights, like your rights as an individual. Because sometimes if you think about boundaries in this regard, it can help you to make sense of them a little bit more, right? Sometimes boundaries can get a little bit of a bad rap, like, well, they're rules and that just feels weird that I'm supposed to have these rules around myself or around people. Well, if you think about them as rights, it can maybe shift that a little bit better for you. So if you think about, I have a basic right to say no and not feel guilty about it. That feels a little bit better than saying I have a boundary to say no, right? So if you think about, I have a basic right to say no and not feel guilty. Shift that language and see if that feels better for you. I have a basic right to be treated with respect. That is also very true. Utilizing that language might also help you too. I have the right to make my needs as important as other people's needs. So again, a basic right, if you say it in that way, it can help to shift that a little bit better. I have the basic need to be accepting of my mistakes and to learn from those mistakes. Again, that's a really good way to shift that language around setting boundaries for yourself and making some changes that you might want to make in your life. I like this one a lot. I like to say, I have the basic right to not meet others' unmanaged expectations of me. I think that one's a really good one because that one's kind of tricky, right? If somebody has unreasonable expectations of you, you have the right to not meet those unreasonable expectations. So I really like that one, and especially if you recognize that as a right, that's a good one to remember. So anyway, perhaps recognizing these items as rights as opposed to boundaries or limits can maybe help shift it a little bit better in your mind when you're creating boundaries for yourself. So something to consider, that these are, rights in your life as opposed to just limits. So some of the tips that I can give you in creating boundaries in your life. When doing any kind of boundary setting, be assertive. You don't have to be aggressive, you don't have to be mean, you don't have to be hateful in any way, just be assertive. There's a little formula that you can use when you are creating a boundary, which is, I feel blank when you do blank. I would like it if you blank instead, right? That's something that can be helpful. So let me give you an example. I feel really overwhelmed when you plan every moment of our vacation. What I would like is if we could have some downtime to just let things unfold a little bit and just be spontaneous. I feel blank when, and you explain what that is. And you are also expressing what it is that you would like. Another tip when setting boundaries is no is a complete sentence. You don't have to overqualify, you don't have to over-explain, you don't have to give a whole lot of explanation, just no. Another thing is you don't have to apologize when you say no. No, I'm sorry. No, sorry, I can't. No, sorry. You don't have to apologize for a boundary. No is a complete sentence, so just remember that. When saying no is a complete sentence, if you add extra information, it actually can give additional emotional labor to other individuals that they don't necessarily need. Because what you're doing is trying to offload your guilt, if you have guilt, because you're trying to, justify why you're not doing X, Y, or Z. And that actually can make some people feel bad, or wonder why they're giving me so many details. If you want to not do something, you can just say no. You don't have to add a lot of extraneous details. No is a complete sentence. With boundaries, you can be either too porous or very rigid, right? And again, like we talked about at the beginning of this video, it's super, super individualized, right? So you can take boundaries too far, and then for most people, it's not having any boundaries at all. So super individualized again, but you could get to the point where, your boundaries are just always yes, and they're super porous, and you never say no to anybody, and that is a problem, right? You could see why that is a problem. But then you could also get to the extreme where your no is the first thing that comes out of your mouth. Your boundary is no all the time, and so that's where boundaries become far too rigid, right? And so you want to try to align your boundaries again with your value, right? What is your value of the situation? What do you want? What is the desire of what you find valuable of whatever the situation is? If you can align with that, you usually will find that middle ground so that it's not always a yes, but it's not always a no either. And again, that's where it can get really tricky. Hard for me to give, clear direction on always say yes or always say no, or wherever your limits are at within a boundary, because there are times when the boundaries can become too rigid, and you need to be careful about that, because you can take it too far. Usually, if you can align that boundary with your value, you can figure that middle ground out so that it's not too porous or too rigid. You may remember when I've talked about self-care in another video, one of the pillars in the self-care foundation is actually boundaries. which is super interesting because you can't take care of yourself if you don't have good boundaries. So it is a very, very important part of being human and having a good, solid life, because you've got to be able to take care of yourself and you have to have good boundaries to be able to do that. It's a really important part of caring for yourself because you've got to figure out what your boundaries are. So it is really important to understand what are your boundaries, figure out what those mean to you. In closing, I want to talk about a really great quote about boundaries. Prentis Hemphill has a really great quote that says, "Boundaries are the line by which I can love myself and still love you." So this is something to keep in mind when you're setting boundaries, right? You've got to find that line that works, that you can still love and care for yourself and still love and care for other people. So keep that in mind when you're setting your boundaries. Remember, when you are setting boundaries, boundaries are about you, and the reaction that you could potentially get from other people, it's not about you, it's about them. So try to remember that when you're setting out your boundary. How somebody reacts towards you setting something up, that's about them, that's not about you. So try to keep that in mind. Hopefully you found this helpful. Hopefully these tips will give you some guidance in being able to set some boundaries and be able to have a good, healthy life. And I appreciate you watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Have a good one.